I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zias-Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello!
Hi, everybody. Welcome
to the show.
Mark. Today we're going to be talking about inventories in RPGs, what they are, how you can use them, different models that they have, and the question that we asked here, are they just busy work? Before we get into our main topic, though, we'd like to give a quick plug for the Kickstarter for Battles of Bestiary Elemental Storm, which as of this present moment has 3 hours to go. Just 3 hours left. This you can find at Kickstarter. And the typical URL for that one, the short URL,
is kickstarter.rollforcombat.com. Right now, it's basically about roughly 2 or 3, maybe even 1 people away from hitting another stretch goal. So it's very, very close. I've brought my computer over there that I will be able to push an update if we make it to that stretch goal. And so it's very exciting that it's in our the final moments, the final hours of the Kickstarter. So without anything else, let's move on to our topic about inventory in RPGs. And this is going to be mostly focused on inventory in tabletop RPGs, but that doesn't mean we won't talk about inventory in video game RPGs a little bit too, because there are large amounts of different ways to handle inventory systems. Like Kevin Tang has mentioned in chat already, Blades in the Dark is already one of the ways that we were going to talk about inventory. You can watch our entire Blades in the Dark episode on YouTube that you can go back to for more information on some of the systems in Blades in the Dark, but that is definitely one of the inventory management systems we'll talk about.
So let's talk a little bit about what inventories are and some of the functions that they can have in the game, and then how some of those desired functions can influence the way that a system is set up.
Absolutely. So what is the goal of having inventory in any kind of game, right? There's some video games and very few tabletop RPGs that just literally have no inventory system that you just, in that, even though this is an RPG, you don't pick up any items at any point in time. And it's just all about like moving along and doing things in the game. Obviously, the most simplistic inventory system is the infinite bag, whether it's actually described as a magical bag that can hold everything, or is just as big as your computer system can hold in a video game, which for modern systems is basically more than you could possibly put in it. So there's no like weight, there's no limit in the number of things you can have. It's just like every time you pick something up, it goes into that inventory and it all gets sorted in some way.
Yeah. So that's completely limitless. Another common variant of that you'll see in video games is either limiting the number of types of items that you can have, and then the number of stacks that you can have. So it may be something like, say, you can hold up to or the number of stacks. You may have something where it's like you can hold any number of items, but you can only hold up to 99 of each item.
Or a number that's lower than 99.
Or you can hold, 50 up to 50 items, and then you can hold up to 9 of each.
Right.
For example.
Sometimes games will put that limit of copies of the same item as a particular way to limit the theoretical amount of in-combat healing you can do. Like in an action RPG where there might be like, okay, so we've got these healing items, but you can only carry up to 4 of those. And maybe even increasing the size of your inventory for certain types of items could be a bonus or a difficult to get benefit you gain from leveling up or going to the right place or doing a quest or something like that. Because in that case, the inventory of how many of a certain thing you can hold is sort of like an economy or almost like a magic point system for that particular type of special ability.
Especially if it's something where the way that you refresh your resources is something that's relatively easy to access.
Yes. In some games, you refresh them automatically, like in an Estus Flash style Souls-like system, Whereas in others, it can be more challenging, but in a lot of them, at least certain types of inventory items eventually are so cheap that as you get richer and richer throughout the game, it's at least easy to refresh them if money is the way that you do it.
And Mathka is mentioning another limitation on inventories that that is often seen in addition to just the raw how many can you carry, which is the cost of access of things. So, if a game has, cheap healing potion that exists, it might limit you by saying, okay, you can only carry up to 99 of this, so you can't infinite heal in battle. Or it might say, using this healing potion takes an action, or it takes your turn, or it takes some other cost, so that you wouldn't necessarily want to continue to use that weaker, large numbers of copies of that weaker consumable that you can easily afford.
There's some games that also have a limitless or near limitless bag that things can be in, but then they're just like, yeah, but this is very inconvenient. In the middle of a fight in this game, you cannot go to that bag, and instead you can equip a certain number of quick ready items onto each of your characters, and that character can only use those items.
Yeah.
And so therefore, even if your bag is full of infinite amount of things, in any given fight, there's only a certain number of items that you're going to pull out.
Or if it's a real-time game instead of a turn-based game, it may be that it takes a certain amount of in-game time to handle like the grabbing the item out of your bag and like the potion drinking animation or what have you.
Absolutely. And so the most abstract forms of inventory management are typically ones where it's not managed at all, because you just kind of write it down on a piece of paper what you have and just keep track of it on your own. The game just mostly says you can gain items and doesn't have like a limitation on it. Or they can be ones where you even don't have to declare what items you had in advance, like Blades in the Dark. So for those of you who are not familiar with Blades in the Dark, as I mentioned before, we have an episode on it where we do mention this in some detail. But the way that their inventory system works is that a lot of the game systems are designed to make it so that you can quickly run a heist without your players being even allowed to spend multiple hours pre-planning it ahead of time. The system won't let them. And it also doesn't encourage doing that, which can really drag down your session or take almost forever to get through. And so the inventory, the way it works is you decide between one of basically three scenarios. Scenario 1, your character is kitted to the nines with like tons of stuff. Everybody can tell you're bad news. It would be like walking into like a train station with like a trench coat that's bulging and looks like it has guns in it, or like wearing obvious Kevlar or something like that and holding a riot shield. Then there is the one on the opposite extreme, which is like you have so little stuff, like nobody, unless they completely pat you down and check you, is going to tell you're anything other than just some regular person on the street who looks like they are completely innocuous. And then in the middle, where you vaguely look like you might be someone who's up to no good, perhaps.
But it's
not
like,
obvious whether you are or not, though. They might need to check more carefully.
So each of those is going to impact the way that people see you, and also the number of items that you can retroactively claim that you have.
Yes, because you don't declare your items, you just declare which of those three states that you're in. And so then, when you needed it, and only if you needed it, you declare an item. So, like, you're about to be shot and killed, and you declare, actually, welp, it hit my armor. At the last second. It saved my life. And then, if you had enough inventory spaces left for it, you suddenly had brought body armor all along. And so that way you are basically, you have an inventory, but only when you need it. So you don't need to spend a lot of time fussing with it before the session is started.
Kevin said, the way I describe it is light is like a plainclothes agent. Normal is dressed like the police. Heavy is dressed like the American police.
There you go. Or you could say like the military police or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's sort of Blades in the Dark, which is a system that is relatively abstract for what you're carrying because of the fact that it is intentionally loose and lets you decide what it is later on, even though it has a fairly discrete inventory system with a specific number of slots in it.
Yeah.
So it is less abstract than like a completely slotless inventory system.
So this is sort of a inventory points type system where you are carrying a certain amount of stuff, but you haven't declared what it is. So another game that we did a full episode on earlier, Fabula Ultima, also has an literal inventory points IP that you have that you then say, okay, well, retroactively this was a magic point healing potion or a hit point healing potion or like an item that I'm going to use my alchemy with or things like that.
They're basically in Fabula Ultima essentially a kind of magic point that is used to cast the items, and you can only replenish by spending money or doing a few other things like stealing from the enemies.
So in that case, the limitation is the amount the total amount that you have. You also see something similar to that happening with, say, an alchemist in Pathfinder when they're doing like their daily preparations or what have you, or when they're doing quick alchemy type stuff, and they're like, how many things can I quickly throw together that I haven't necessarily prepared in advance. So you can see some of these systems kind of mix things up, but that's more of the abstract. You have a certain amount of inventory that you're carrying with you, and you don't have to decide what it is until you need it, or you can quickly convert some kind of abstract resource into what you need when you need it.
Right. So the next step on this spectrum after that is that you have an amount of inventory and you do have to declare what it is in advance. And typically those can go from, just a few, and you declare them item by item, all the way up to the nitty gritty of like pounds or something in between, like the bulk system in Starfinder and Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And so while certain RPG genealogies, such as the Dungeons and Dragons genealogy, is more likely to use pounds because, being able to carry a certain amount of weight kind of feels like it's doing more to simulate that you're going on an RPG adventure than if they have like a Diablo style, well, you have this many inventory slots and things take up an amount of space based on how big the sprite of the object is. It turns out that weight is just something that there's something about weight that makes people more likely not to use it as an inventory system. Part of it is that it feels like it's not as impactful. Part of it is that it feels like it's a lot of busy work. It takes a lot of time and effort, especially when it's things like arrows that you're constantly firing and then recovering, and you have to keep track of exactly how many there are.
And then if it feels like in the system that there are some characters who struggle to carry around what players feel like is kind of the basic set of things that they need, that can also cause challenges and make people more likely to be like, man, I'm not going to work with that.
Ironically, if the system makes it too easy to carry the basic set of things that you need, then it also makes these people even more likely to abandon it, because they're like, well, what's the point? Everybody can carry everything that they need, so why even care?
Yeah.
I'm going to stop you, your GM might say, if you're trying to carry this 20-foot tall statue of solid lead out of the building, but other than that, whatever, this system is so lenient on carrying capacity that you never hit the max.
Whenever but I'm saying like in the one, so exactly, in the one direction, if the character's like, well, I can't even carry like a basic weapon and the things and like the basic kit for the skill that I usually use or whatever, then it's going to be annoying. But on the other hand, if it's like, yeah, well, I have high strength, so I'm just going to carry everything unless the conversation is about, like, can I loot an entire dungeon and carry everything with me at the same time? Thinking about, like, Oblivion-style stuff where it's like, well, I can always carry all these things, and then it's just about, like, how many trips am I going to have to take out of the dungeon?
That's right. Now, one of the big problems that comes out of this is that there are some games, especially in the D&D lineage, where the only thing that strength does for you, more or less, if you're not a melee fighter, is more carrying capacity. Yeah. And so, obviously, this is a a conflicting bad set of factors if you have something that people are likely not to use and that is a balancing factor for one of the stats.
Yeah.
Now, if it actually is really draconian, like Linda mentioned an example, but even maybe more draconian than Linda was thinking of, so that it's obvious to pretty much every GM and player that having super low strength means you can't carry almost anything, that actually increases the chances that a group won't ignore the system, because they'll realize, wait a minute, with this system and the way they're doing it, with my character who minimized strength, I can barely carry anything.
Yeah.
So the GM won't be like, oh, well, we'll ignore it then.
So it's not like, well, you can almost carry the basics. It's like, okay, yeah, you decided to dump strength. Congratulations. Like, you can't carry it. The fighter is carrying everything for you, other than, like, your basic water.
You can't even wear armor. I hope you didn't want it, for instance. And so that causes some tension, because there's some games where that is kind of true about strength, but it's not as obvious because it happens at a certain gradient and there are some ways to go around it. So then it encourages people to ignore the inventory, and it devalues strength as a resource. So how can we do better? The problem is that to do better, you need to create something that's more compelling. It needs to be more compelling, and that often means it's a little less simulationist, where the simulationist, we're doing it with pounds or something that tells you how much a person can carry based on their strength, is what a lot of the games in the sort of the D&D genealogy are looking for. And so if we move something to something a little more abstract, or perhaps a little less abstract, but in a way that really makes the inventory feel evocative and makes the inventory feel like it's not just sort of tacked on and vestigial, that can help make inventories more exciting and make people more likely to want to use them. So what do I mean by even less abstract than this? Because many people probably thought D&D, we reached the end of the spectrum. So there's some games where inventory is so tied in that it's even just a fundamental aspect of the game is messing around with inventory. Any of you who've checked out us playing video games on this channel, which we do occasionally, might have seen Linda playing Backpack Hero, a video game that's entirely about reorganizing your backpack to put things like adjacent to or above or underneath certain other things.
It's both the size of, it's both the size of your inventory, but also the shape of the items. And then if you have like, whenever I have this particular armor, any other armor pieces that are adjacent to it grant one more defense. And if I have a weapon that's adjacent to it, it grants one more attack or something like that. So then the shape and the size and everything about your inventory configuration is fundamental to the game. And it's all about customizing which items do you take, when do you take them, how much space do you spend on like consumable items versus permanent ones, things like that.
That's right. And if you're thinking, okay, but that's a video game, are there any tabletop RPGs that really, really care about your inventory in the same way? I would say over in the OSR style space, the game Knave by Ben Melton has a system where basically your inventory is just about everything for you. So, are you a spellcaster? Great! You've got grimoires that have each of your spells. If you're like a wizard type person, you don't necessarily have a class. It's dependent on like what your stats are good at and what you put in your inventory. If you put religious icons that can do some divine stuff in there, great. Then you've got the divine spells that are based on that. You could have weapons that will eventually break. And your inventory slots getting sort of beaten up and damaged are a way that you get hurt in the game system. And once it gets to your actual hit points, you're nearly dead by that point, and you're gonna die very soon. And so in that case, like your inventory management, it's really, really tied in, which makes it one of the games that uses like the old D&D style, when you loot gold, the number of gold pieces you loot becomes your experience points. That's a very classic style. It's not my favorite style of awarding experience points, but in a game like Knave, where it's all about your inventory, that is actually a really, really compelling way to give experience points, because you need enough space left in your inventory that was not damaged, that was not where you're carrying your books and your religious icons and your weapons and other things, to hold the gold to get XP. And so it's a very risk reward. If you're going to be greedy, you want to drop your weapons in the middle of the dungeon and just put all this gold that you found so you can get more XP. You can go for it. It's a risk reward factor. So I think that is a tabletop RPG that exemplifies the idea of inventories can be more than just busy work. But obviously, Ben Milton put a lot of effort into the way that inventory is treated in that system in order to do that, rather than it just being about like pounds and then you have to track exactly how much each thing weighs.
And when taking a look at the aspects, you alluded to a bit with arrows about the aspects of inventory systems that people are more likely to ignore. Ammunition is... Non-magical ammunition, I have found in my experience, is one of the first things to get ignored, as well as basic provisions like food and water. And I think that's because there's something that is constantly going up and down. There's something that past the very beginning of the game, the amount of money that they cost is not that much compared to how much the characters use. And there's something that, they are more down to earth and normal, and they don't feel as interesting as, say, like, oh, this is a magic item that I'm using. If it's like, okay, yes, we go on our trip and we buy 60 units of food. Okay, now we have 56 units of food. Okay, now we have et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes, past sometimes the very low levels, those kinds of things are only tracked in adventures that are specifically focused around survival situations. And so you can easily use, pretty much the rest of the system around the inventory tracking if you're just like, okay, yeah, you know what? The party has a pack mule who's carrying, some of these basic provisions that they have, and we're not really going to worry about that too much, except for, the PCs know they're going on an adventure into a dangerous area. And I would say in that case, if you have been not tracking for a very long time and then suddenly you are planning to start tracking because of an unusual circumstance, giving the players and the characters heads up, hey, they're about to go into an unusual circumstance. We're actually going to care what you have, so that they have time to think about it first, instead of just like you're in the middle of the session, you're like, exactly how many arrows did you buy in town? One hadn't thought about that before. And then you can make it as a snapshot. I remember a particular situation in the Jade Regent campaign that Mark was running, where it was relevant, the approximate number of arrows that my archer was carrying, because she needed to use them as firewood to create a bonfire in a survivalist situation.
That's right. So basically, the more mental bandwidth that an inventory system takes for the less benefit and interest, the more likely it is to be ignored. That's generally true for almost any subsystem in a tabletop RPG, but inventory is just one that is very likely, compared to any other, to be just completely ignored by a group. To be a house rule of like, yeah, we're playing by all the rules as written, but of course not actual inventory management.
Yeah. Another thing that might cause people to ignore it is if they get overwhelmed by the number of items that they have in it, and those items don't necessarily feel as useful to them. So I've definitely had a lot of situations where later in a campaign, I work with the other players in a group, because I'm often one of the inventory spreadsheet managers for a home group, most frequent one. Where we're going to be like, okay, how many things in here have we earned that we're never going to use, because like this item is only useful around like level up to 3 and we're now level 17 or whatever, and we found this thing and we need to like clean these things out. If it's something that doesn't sell for very much money and we're probably not going to use, then it's kind of like a pain to track those kinds of things. So I find that it's definitely worth going through like at least every level or so to say, hey, what do we have? Do we have items that are cool that we haven't assigned to anyone? Do we have things that we want to say, hey, let's use this soon? Or do we want to say like, oh, let's just sell this off?
That's right. It can be very tricky, because when you have a system where items cost an exponential amount more as you level up. That's true in D&D 5e, true in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, true in a lot of tabletop RPGs. Some of them are more like a quadratic or quartic, but still they scale up so quickly that it might as well be close to exponential because you're only doing it over a small number of levels. When it's exponentially more, it's a problem if the items are extremely potent across a wide variety of levels, because when you get to a level where you're much higher level than the item, you can buy an astronomical number of the item. Now, there are ways around that, such as the resonance system in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest. People often dislike those. Honestly, the resonance system was an example of an inventory management system that was like a more interactive, like harder inventory management system rather than like a soft inventory management system based on bulk that is easy to get around with a pack mule. In a sense, even though it's a complicated and we put it closer to the end of the scale of nitty gritty, to the nitty gritty end, it was a soft system in the sense that like you could have like a bag of holding or a donkey and you can just put all your stuff on it and carry all of your things. But in a sense, when you have the inventory being managed, people don't necessarily like it as much if they're used to having a nearly unmanaged inventory, especially if their group is used to ignoring the inventory system. Can be difficult to, like, let's say someone proposed, let's do a Knave style inventory in like the next D&D or Pathfinder. People would probably riot against that because they're used to having something they could ignore potentially for the inventory. The problem is that having a system like that actually makes it easier to create items that are useful across a wide variety of levels, because in that case, the opportunity cost of, sure, your third level item is still really good at level 17, but it's still not nearly as good as level 17 item. And by having that third level item, you now can't have a level 17 item because there's a limit to the number of items you can have.
Or like the replenishing item type style mechanics, like how, alchemists, things that they have per day can scale up in power because they're like, okay, this is a daily resource that you're using. It's not something that you could stockpile into the stratosphere.
Yeah, so I see some mentioning in chat that says that D&D 5e is quadratic and not exponential. So it is exponential. If you look at when you go up between the different rarities, not only is it kind of usually like, it's within this range, but they go up by a times 10 factor each time, and that makes it exponential. Now, D&D 3.5 was like kind of more in a polynomial equation, a lot of things scaled quadratically, but when you're looking at it over the course of 1 to 20, like, the question of how did we get from starting with 300 gold and then things at the end game costing 200,000, like, whether you did that with an exponential function or a polynomial function doesn't matter. The main point is that things were worth 1,000 times more.
Yeah, the point is that if 1,000 copies of the first level item are drastically better than one copy of the 20th level item, then there's an issue.
So there's a question of whether resonance was the same thing as D&D item attunement. No, investiture is. Investiture used to be combined into resonance. Basically, you should watch the Arcane Mark What If you want to see about certain ideas that didn't make it into the playtest at all or didn't make it from the playtest into the final. For Pathfinder 2e, there's a whole one on resonance. Basically, it combines the attunement style investiture with the ability to activate items a certain number of times per day that was charisma based. And so therefore it would be like, yeah, sure, this low level mist elixir is pretty good even at level 20. It's not the greatest at level 20 because you're level 20, but it's still pretty useful. But then you used one of your resonance and you could have used that for any other kind of item, so there was a true cost to it. As opposed to if there's a level 1 mist elixir that's even remotely good at all at level 20, and you have thousands of times as much money at level 20, you can have so many of those that you will always have that active at all times. It's sort of the issue that still exists in Pathfinder 2 because some of the items actually are useful up to a lot of levels later, even despite the fact that they're made to obsolete. And so people often talk about trivializing situations with, like, let's say, a party full of items that cast 6th rank heroism at like super high levels. It's like, yeah, it's not as good as 9th rank heroism, which we could have also cast, but it's close enough. And so we're full of enough wands of this that we just have it active on everyone all the time.
Yeah.
That's one example. There's other examples as well. It's tricky, and it is sort of an unstable equilibrium that's based on the fact that Pathfinder 2e does not have a strict inventory management system that is meant to curtail the use of an unlimited number of items. Not really. It has a more simulation style. How much do we think you can carry based on your strength and body type? And for that reason, if you watch our episode on different economies, you can see that the only economy that's affecting the magic items at that point becomes gold. And
Yes.
With that being the case, it limits your design in a large number of ways.
So we've talked a bit about items obsoleting. There's also the items that are on the other side of the inventory, the Mega Elixir type items, the ones that are so
Too good to use.
Too good to use. They're too rare and expensive and powerful that you're just thinking, oh my gosh, when am I ever possibly going to use this?
So those can just be rough. In general, we've had episodes where we talk about the Mega Elixir issue when we're talking about consumables in particular. Consumables are just tough overall. The main question about RPG inventories, however, and how that ties in, is does your inventory system promote having this Mega Elixir issue, or does it lead that issue to create a different kind of issue, the selling the Mega Elixir issue, or is it one that tries to sidestep that problem entirely? So, for instance, if you can just carry an unlimited number of things, it's easy to be running around with tons of those Mega Elixirs that you're never going to use. If you have a strict limit of items and the Mega Elixir is so rare that you're never going to feel like there's any situation where you can use it.
Then you're going to be like, ugh, I'm always spending a space on the Mega Elixir because I can't throw it out, but I also can't use it.
And you might, at that point, try to sell it if it sells for a decent amount. Although, in some video games, those super Mega Elixirs may sell for like one of the type of money that it is because it's not meant to be sold. In which case, then you're really tearing your hair out because you can't sell it, you can't really use it. Then you might just use it arbitrarily at a time that you don't need it, just to get it out of your inventory.
Yeah. Matt Guy Dave is talking about Stolen Fates mechanic for consumables. There's an NPC that gives you consumables 2 at a time that are your level, and you have to use them. Can't sell them to get more.
No, and that's very similar
really cool.
when we talked to consumable. In our whole consumable episode, we talked about Gardens of Power, the system I wrote for Treasure Vault, Estus Flash style systems where you get items at a certain time, you have to use them, or they go bad after the end of the day, or whatever the factor of time is. Those can work better for some groups. But when we're talking about the Mega Elixir issue, we really run into a system that has this problem for people with consumables. We should talk about the inventory system in the Cypher system. So that is basically a system, it's even named for the consumable items, the ciphers that are in it. I've played a decent amount of Cypher system, not a ton. And what I've run into with the Cypher system is you have a very small number of slots. So the idea is they're the unique ciphers. They do something completely different and wacky. They're sometimes very good. And you use them because you keep finding them at a pretty high rate and you can't hold more, right? But if you just keep using them, you'll get to use them all the time. What I ran into was that I would use them sometimes when they weren't that good. Oftentimes I wouldn't need them, so I just wouldn't use them. And I would just keep replacing, either using a bad one or often not using it and replacing it with better ones until I had one that I was like, darn, this cipher is way better than the other ones we've seen. And also, I don't really need them. So I'm going to hang on to that. And once all of my slots were filled with ones like that, the Mega Elixir, so to speak, I basically never used them again until I ran into a really bad situation where I needed to, which in one of the campaigns never happened. So I just had the strongest ciphers I had ever seen. Mm-hmm. I cycled through dozens of the ability to pick up more ciphers and never did.
Yeah. So, like, that system generally then seems to have been designed to be like, hey, you should use them or you won't get to pick up new ones. But then, since you were saying, hey, I have the best ones that I've ever seen, I don't want to trade this out for something worse. Whereas, as I recall, when I was playing it, I generally did that, except I tried to have one slot that was rotating to see more things.
For most of the time, I had a rotating slot. Eventually, I reached a point where I had ones that were not only especially strong, but were very good for my character. And I was just like, these fill in holes in situations where my character, if I fight that one particular thing, will be in big trouble. Because I had a one particular cipher system character, not to get too in the weeds, who was incredibly resilient to like physical damage and was pretty resilient even to damage that was like supposed to be not avoidable. But one of the types of defenses that existed could bypass that too, because it was like, if it was like unavoidable psychic damage or something like that, I could avoid it. But there was like one weird starfish monster we fought that like dealt me unavoidable damage that was not the same kind of unavoidable damage. And we found a cipher that was good in that situation. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, this is exactly what I need, because if we ever fight that weird starfish type thing again, I will use this cipher. And we never did. But like, it made sense to me, I think. I think I wasn't misplaying by holding that as one of the slots at all times, because we found my kryptonite, and it was like the kryptonite.
Yes.
The anti-kryptonite suit. And so, like, that can be an issue even if the player doesn't misplay. And I'm not saying I always play right when you've got limited slots with Mega Elixirs. I definitely play
You're a
too
hoarder
conservatively because I'm a hoarder.
And then doesn't use them. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except for sometimes in the final battle.
Absolutely. So that's why you need to think about whether you have a loose or strict inventory management, because if it's too strict, it can lead to the Mega Elixir problem becoming even more of a problem for certain players, or really more of a problem for almost everyone, just in different ways. And so Autumn Didact in chat said the discussion is reminding them of managing leads as an investigators, and you have only 2 at a time. Yeah, you have to be careful with those. At least if you have, like, it's like 10 minutes, you can go get another lead again. Whereas within the cipher system, there's never really an expectation you're going to be able to go back and get the cipher that you left behind. Theoretically, maybe you can if you left it on the floor somewhere, but usually you don't come back to that location. But definitely, when you only have 2 or 3 slots, it can really leave you feeling squeezed. And sometimes that can be a really good thing that's like part of the game's charm.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have as many slots going on. Like how in Blades in the Dark, you select how many slots you have, essentially, and then that's good. And then you have to think about when are you going to introduce a new item to the scene.
Right. But the good thing about that is that you only have to introduce the item when you needed it. So if you had a Mega Elixir back in the base, say, maybe it was literally called Mega Elixir because your Blades in the Dark group likes making jokes. You would then not need to use one of your very limited slots to say it was the Mega Elixir. And then if your character was if the team was about to die, you would be like, actually, one of the things I was carrying was the Mega Elixir.
Yes.
Everybody full heals and loses all of their stress. Oh my gosh, what are we doing in Blades in the What are we allowing in Blades in the Dark if everyone loses all of their stress and fully heals? That's ridiculous. But I guess that's what's the Mega Elixir.
Yep. Now I'm just thinking about, like, what kind of entity do you make a pact with to get that to happen, and what is the cost going to be after the fact?
Exactly. So, it's probably pretty high. The point is that you could actually sub out the inventory system in your game for a different one, instead of just dropping the inventory system in your game. If you find that the inventory system doesn't work well for your group, you can just create your own homebrewed one. But if you do that, you need to follow the suggestions that Linda and I mentioned before. The suggestion is, if you make it really, really easy to just have whatever you want in your inventory system, then it's not necessarily worth having if it requires a lot of tracking. if you make it like kind of hard, but you can still get really what you need in there, as Linda was saying, that also makes people kind of not want to use it. If you make it ridiculously strict, people are more likely to use and pay attention to it. But if you homebrewed it and it's ridiculously strict, it's more likely that the players will be mad at you and be like, did you have to be this mean? This is so strict. This is like draconian compared to the normal game system. It can be harder in the social contract unless your group also is like, yes, we want an extra challenge with limited inventory slots.
I would say, like, to me, the ideal inventory system is something that isn't going to for your group, is something that's not going to overwhelm your players. That's going to give them interesting options and help them have different choices that they might want to take. So, it's if your players are going to be like, oh my gosh, our inventory has 400 items in it and I don't even know like what we're doing, whatever, I'm not going to bother with it. Versus if they're going to, that's one extreme. But if your inventory system is like, well, we don't really have that many items, then I guess at that point you're going toward a different sort of game where the things that your characters do are not so based on items. But
absolutely,
I personally prefer something where I generally prefer things that are more on the granular side, but I do see that you have these issues on both ends where like if you don't keep on top of it, then sometimes you might forget you had that item or not use something, and then it starts off as a too powerful Mega Elixir, and then you realize much later that now it's not very strong, and now you're like, oh man, we should have used that earlier. So
yep, it's definitely a serious conundrum when it comes to inventory management. And so one way to figure out, is inventory management just busy work for your group, is to ask the other players if you're the GM. Or if you're talking about like for your game and you're a game designer, you're designing a new game, you need to ask yourself what the gameplay loop is going to be and just kind of what kind of behaviors you want to encourage and what the limiting factors are on certain variables.
It's also worth making sure that the items that you have in the game have their own identity. And systems vary in how much they do this. We've talked about this in our episode on weapons, how you might, some games might just have one sword and it's called sword. Or, they have swords, but, the Blade Dancer can equip Blade Dancer weapons, and they exist in a chain of Blade Dancer weapons that are either strictly improving from one to the next, or maybe sometimes you make choices, but usually you're just kind of going up for what you're going to do, weapon A or weapon B at this point, but you're mostly just going up through the system. Then, that's more straightforward than if it's like, well, I have these 50 different weapons that I could choose from. Because sometimes when you have a lot of choices that are similar, then it also feels like, why am I bothering with this? To some players, where some might be like, hey, I really wanted to get into the reads of like, this weapon has this property versus this weapon has this property. I care about whether the weapon has shove or grapple or trip or like what it looks like or what the story of the weapon is. And some people might just be like, why do we have all these tables? I just want to swing sword.
Exactly. And Kevin Tang pointed out the same issue, which is even if your group forms a social contract that's like 4/5, 5/6, 6/7 of players all want to do this, that just takes that one player to just not do the inventory system and boycott the inventory system, and it can really put a monkey wrench into the gears.
Yeah, I would say that, things like arrow tracking and provision tracking, things like that, as I mentioned before, that they technically exist in these games, but I would recommend not leaning into them too much. I mean, sure, if you have you have special magic arrows and you really want to think about when you fire those. Yeah, absolutely. But like there's more picky things, like unless there's specifically an adventure around it, I don't bother with that. And I think also that if you are a player or a kind of a facilitator player or a GM at a table, and you know that one of the players at your table Mark is at your table. It's not you, Mark, but
Oh
Mark...
no, you just named this problematic player as Mark. Maybe they're not problematic.
All right, his name is Mork.
His name is Mork.
Mork. Mork is at your table. You're not like this, is why I can say this. Mork just like doesn't want to care about inventory and all these kinds of other things. And the group and Mork is a greatsword wielder, and the group finds a good greatsword. And then you can be like, "Hey, Mork, you have a +2 striking flaming a +2 greater striking flaming greatsword that we found. Do you want it?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." And then like you can be like, "Hey, here, take this item," and then give them like items that they can use that are like very specific. And you kind of know then they're not going to mess around with the consumables and the ticky tack stuff. But
what if you have Mindy in your party who wants to mess with all the consumables?
Well, then Mindy can have the character that has all the consumables, and then the group can be like, "Yeah, Mork's not really using other items. Let's make sure Mork has a powerful flaming greatsword because that's what Mork cares about."
There you go. So the reality is that as Kevin pointed out in chat, even if you have a group consensus, you also need to care about individual consensus when you're determining what to do with inventories. Similarly, a smaller and more manageable amount of inventory makes anything kind of more likely to work. For instance, in a system where you did count arrows, maybe there could be a system where, yeah, you know what? You have a very limited number of inventory slots, period. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that can fit in one of those slots is 5 arrows, let's say. And you could also fit a spell book in there that can cast an arcane spell. So it's like you could either have an arcane spell or 5 arrow shots. And those are just like a resource that is going to take up your space. And maybe we don't care about buying the arrows, but like at the end of the day, like you make more arrows that can fill the slots. But your loadout for the day is basically, it's like daily prepared spells, but with arrows for your archery. And maybe in that game, ranged attacks are very powerful. Like they do a good amount of damage, and a lot of enemies can't really do much to you as you attack them from range with a very melee meta. And so the advantage of ranged would be in that case the ability to attack without being hit back, but the disadvantage would be you eventually run out of these arrows. And that's easier to keep track of because of the fact that it's a very specific mechanic.
Mm-hmm. Autumn mentioned something cool when using Foundry, using the party stash, which is a GM you can hand wave as stuff the party has stored elsewhere, like at home or in a safe spot in a dungeon. Yeah, so instead of saying, yeah, you have all this stuff and that means you have to track it all the time, you can be like, all right, what are the things that you're kind of bringing with you on the adventure and engaging with?
Absolutely. And so the answer for some groups could be, hey, maybe the inventory kind of might be Busywork if we had to do it, but fortunately, Foundry or your virtual tabletop will do it for you. Yeah,
and I find that another one where you sometimes get into trouble is who's carrying what. This is something that as our group's resident inventory manager, I often find myself doing, which is like, all right, we realize we're in a tough situation and we'd love to use that scroll of fireball, but like, who do we put that scroll of fireball on? So like, I try to, when we get things, be like, scroll of fireball, the party wizard can use that. So the party wizard, do you want to carry the scroll of fireball? Or like, the party wizard and the party witch can both use that. Is one of you interested in carrying the scroll of fireball? And then like noting down on the inventory like who has what, so that then when it comes up you don't have to have a discussion. Or when we buy or when we get items in batches or something, like with healing potions or things like that are just general use, it tends to be more like, okay, well, let's get enough healing potions so that everyone can carry 3. All right, everybody's got 3, and Cleric's like, I don't really need to carry healing potions. I've got spells. It's like, all right, we can get healing potions for everyone but Cleric, and then I could just write down each person has 3 healing potions.
One of the things that can be the most complicated for your Linda-style, Mindy-style player who wants to keep track of everything for your group is that you might have a standout item that is so standout good that it is powerful for anyone in the group and provides a significant boost to whoever has it. and you might have a group where not everybody comes each week, and it's standard to have their character not be there if the player is not there. In which case, the Linda style person, and I've seen this in our group with our Linda style person, Linda, may have to create a conditional table of like, okay, so we're generally giving this hand wraps to the monk, but when the monk doesn't show up, we'll give the hand wraps to this other person, and if neither of them is there, we give it to the summoner because they can just apply it to their idol, whatever they're carrying to their idol.
Yeah, so we'll have so it'll be like +1 striking hand wraps parentheses monk, comma or this character, comma or this character parenthetically. That's the way that I tend to do it. I like to do things that way in part because personally then I can more easily search and see like what characters' names appear a lot and a little, and then if there's something that's like, oh, this could be good for anybody, then I can notice, Barbarian sure be getting a lot of treasure, but we haven't given something good to Cleric in a while. And then that can also be like when we come into a large sum of money, can be like, hey guys, I noticed that Barbarian has a lot more wealth than Cleric. How would folks feel about getting something for the Cleric? And they're like, oh yeah, let's get something for the Cleric. And it's like, oh, Cleric player, what do you want to buy?
By the way, this provides an answer to Kevin Tang's question, a maybe somewhat hilarious answer, of what do you do if 6 out of 7 players want to do inventory tracking, but the last person doesn't do it? Which is, well, if you have someone who's Linda style, as obsessed with tracking your inventory, then that's fine, because Linda, like that last person doesn't know what items they have, but that's okay because Linda knows what items everybody has.
Yes.
In case they're not there or for other reasons.
Here's the thing, though, because I have the inventory tracking spreadsheet, and it's shared with everyone, and it's pinned in the Discord, but still, I have to do most of the work.
But it is a solution to the question. And
yeah.
Kevin was wondering, like, what should I do? Like, the one person isn't tracking their arrows. It's like, well, if Linda's tracking their arrows...
I don't track people's arrows. That would be a pain in the butt. But I do track, who has what permanent items and, like, generally where the consumables are.
The answer is get your own Linda for your group.
I just like bookkeeping, okay? I'm not necessarily the best person to ask, what do you do if you don't like bookkeeping? But, I do think that things like those sort of Estus Flask, Gardens of Power type systems where it's like, okay, or like Pathfinder Society, school consumable type things, where you're just like, okay, you have a once per day blah, and you're not otherwise, that scales with your level, and you're not otherwise having to deal with all these sorts of things, or like simplifying things down and having fewer consumables could definitely help with that sort of thing. Or like if you have a mechanism for like upgrading a consumable to a higher level version by like bringing it by paying some extra money or resources. So instead of being like, oh yeah, this thing isn't going to get completely obsolete, I just need to upgrade it to the next stage or what have you.
Combine X number of lesser healing potions to make a moderate healing potion.
Yeah, exactly. You could totally have a system like that. So if your players are like, oh, this is too weak for us at this point, it's like, well, if you have a lot of them, you can combine them together and make a more powerful one that's more...
Linda, they're saying level. You could change your title at the bottom from freelancer to arrow counter. That's the one thing she doesn't count.
I count my own character's arrows until usually for a while, but I don't bother tracking other people's arrows unless like it actually there's a situation where it matters. Then I will help them count.
What I usually do if I'm playing an archer is I buy a number of arrows that the GM and I mutually agree is more than I can possibly fire for the campaign, and be like, I've clearly overspent on these arrows. Now we can just forget about them from this point onward, because that's even beyond the degree to which I would usually like to track.
Donna in chat makes a good point too. If you want your players to track arrows, make sure you're not just letting them buy in towns. You need to give them opportunity to get from adversaries, craft, etc., so they can be rewarded for that cost of tracking.
Absolutely. When you have a restriction, make sure it's a real restriction and that it's one that interfaces with the game. It can make it more interesting the more that it's tied in. That's something we've seen throughout this episode as we've sort of gone through different video game and tabletop RPG systems.
And it's a barter principle too, just like how we've often talked about. It's not worth anyone's time to put in a skill check that doesn't matter because the plot will move forward in exactly the same way, no matter how you get it, or you can keep trying over and over again until you succeed. If it's something that has no stakes and no consequences and it's just taking time to resolve, well, my friend, you have 1 million gold pieces. Did you pay your 3 gold piece tax to restock the arrows for your army? No, let me go pay my 3 gold piece tax for restocking the arrows for my army. Like, it's boring.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you need it to be impactful. You need it to actually have a restriction somewhere, and that's where you run afoul sometimes with these weight-based systems if it's too easy to carry things. A lot of weight-based systems, I don't know, they tell me that a character with absolutely garbage strength can carry an amount of stuff that I certainly couldn't carry without slowing down.
Yeah.
And it's like, can you though? They're actually a little bit generous about how much you can carry, sometimes to the detriment of the system for being used.
Yeah, Matt Guy talks about like another issue too with like when you use about speaking of items no one will ever use, special arrows like dragon flaying.
Like sometimes if it's specific enough and then the specific thing comes up, it's easier to use that than a Mega Elixir, because at least if you get that this is the red dragon slaying arrow and then a red dragon appears,
dragon showed up,
you can be like, I'm never going to fight another red dragon unless this is the red dragon campaign, so I might as well.
So I think that, Kevin had a different experience with that. I think that speaks to how people's experiences can be very different with the different aspects of inventory systems, whether it's like I'm never going to use this. Oh, man, this is just the perfect item for this specific circumstance.
Exactly. And so based on the way people think in your group, you can figure out the right inventory system. Like, I'm very much I'll hold on to this item. Maybe I'll find a use for it later. And if I do, I feel good about it, like Kevin. But in some systems, especially ones like Pathfinder 1, where you could just sell it back and then craft an item for the same amount of money and you would lose no value from this, it certainly was extremely punishing to keep your items instead of selling for the most bleeding edge optimized item that you possibly could. The worse the sellback rate, ironically, and this is tied to both your inventory and your amount of money, the better it was for the idea of just holding on to the items in your inventory and seeing if you could find a situation where you could use them. And so that's something that you need to understand your group's personalities and each of the different players. Because if you don't, you might come up with an inventory system that doesn't fit what your group wants or needs.
Yeah, the closer the more the value of the item you can get out of selling it, the more that items tend to feel, compared to like the amount you have to pay to get it, whether it's by crafting or buying on the open market, the more that items tend to feel interchangeable and fungible, and versus if you can't sell them for very much. So then like exactly what the items are matter less, which isn't necessarily as interesting for, hey, this is the cool loot that you found and you expect people to probably want to use it, but it does mean that you're less likely to run into situations where the players are like, oh man, we found a full plate, but no one wears full plate. We're not really getting that much for this. So I think in a lot of those kinds of systems where you can't sell for as much, those things that that no one's going to use tend to just, if things sell for say 10%, you can just be like, okay, yes, I know that what I'm actually giving the players isn't this item. I'm giving them the money cost of 10% of this because this is a more interesting way to give them things than gold coins or credits or what have you.
Absolutely. So as we've gone through, we've looked at an entire spectrum of possible inventory systems that you can use, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's all sorts of ways that inventory can be handled. Don't assume just because maybe you're used to, say, only D&D and Pathfinder style that it always has to be like weight or bulk based. There's a ton of interesting inventory systems that are out there that might be the right one for your group. If your group's always trying to skip it, you might want to intuit or even ask why that is. Figure out who is not being served. Is the inventory system too burdensome mentally? Is it too easy to just get whatever you need and so there's not much of a point to it?
Mm-hmm.
And is it worth it to house rule or adopt from borrowing from another RPG a different inventory system to replace
for example, maybe your group would rather have something where items don't feel as essential in certain ways, and they'd rather do something like an automatic bonus progression system where your characters have certain numbers that are just going to go up over time, and then items are kind of reserved for special powers and things like that. So you might have fewer items that are flowing around.
Absolutely. So take a look into that, and you can find out the truth for your group of whether RPG inventories are just busy work. I think that's covered all the tips that I wanted to give, Linda. If that's true for you as well, let's do a vote for our next episode. I know. And so somebody else wanted a design diaries, classes versus classless systems. Someone put it into the comments, so I'm going to replace it. And I'm going to also link the Kickstarter. It did reach its most recent stretch goal, but the computer that I brought over here, which I just unplugged from being charged throughout the day, seems to have lost its power. So once I repower it, I will push the update that there's yet another hidden stretch goal that Steven managed to pull out of his pocket somehow. So that Kickstarter is about to end.
This one, right?
Yeah, but I'm not going to do that in the middle of a stream when we're streaming. We should not be streaming with not being plugged in.
You're right. It might get messed up.
I
do have it set on high performance mode even when not plugged in.
Yeah, but I just don't think that's a good idea.
Fair enough.
So we have one vote for design diaries, classes versus classless systems. The choices are Build a Hazard Workshop, Ask Arcade Mark, Save My Game Q&A, Design Diaries, Classes versus Classless Systems, Arcade Mark Plays, where we play a game on this channel, and other. You can vote in the chat 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, although you should specify.
Kevin, I agree that solving a problem with one copper bar soap is fun and exciting. When people know the weird ways to use their inventory.
One of the most creative things I seen was there was a new player that I was running for a group of new players. It was in 3rd edition D&D. And they were faced with a heartbeat at pretty low levels. And the new player was like, okay, that's fine. I go into my spell component pouch, and I've written down everything that all of the spells I have in my spell book use, because it says they're all in my pouch. And since the minor illusion spell, minor image, said that it had, or silent image said that it had wool to pull the wool over people's eyes, I'd like to take that and stuff it into my ears. I was like, that's really good. Yes. And so so it looks like that classes versus classless systems has won again easily, and so the tyranny of 3 shall continue onward. And that guy Dave said, I wonder if my vote even counts. Blue dot energy. Your vote always counts.
Speaking of blue dots, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and if you want to hear more from us, hit the little notification bell. And if you really like what we've created and want to support us more, thank you very much. You can hit the join button to join.
You'll become a leaf leshy if you do.
Indeed.
And of course, if you'd like to chat with us, you can always come to our Discord
at tiny.cc/arcademark.
That's
Everybody
right.
is welcome.
You're welcome to tiny.cc/arcademark, where we hang out and are generally pretty chill over there in all of the channels, except maybe the one where people sometimes gripe a bit. All right. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you on Saturday for the episode that's about errata. And then next Tuesday, we'll talk about classes versus classless systems. Take care and have a great week. Bye.
Bye.